Thank you so much for joining me. This is Dean Levitt. He's an expert on startups and SaaS, software as a service businesses. And he's going to answer some questions for us on about startups, why they fail, and how to make it when you're just getting started. So thank you so much for joining us today, Dean.
My pleasure. Thanks so much for having me.
How's the weather in Tel Aviv?
It's hot today.
I imagine it's hot most days. But
Right.
How does the business dynamics in Israel compare to the U.S.? Is there a big difference there?
Sure. I'd say no. I worked in startups for 12, 13 years in the US before moving here. Israel has a very US-centric based startup ecosystem. So most of the work here is actually designed for the US market.
Interesting. And so if we could dive into kind of why startups fail in general, what are the metrics that could make a startup fail?
Sure. The key, and I don't mean to be facetious here, but the key killer is running out of money.
Yeah.
So if we're going to think about what leads to that, it comes down to two things: your growth and your churn. So I think tracking customer acquisition is vital. It tells you if you've got the right product, it tells you when you need to raise next, etc. And then churn is the killer. If you're losing 20% of your customers month over month, you got to work that much harder to grow.
Yeah. And so for those of us that aren't too hip to the lingo of Silicon Valley and the startups, when you're doing a capital raise, we hear X got millions of dollars. How do you burn through that much money so fast? Where does the money go?
Chasing growth, actually. So
okay.
Growth is as far as I've seen, it's pretty much growth at all costs. So once you've raised $20 million, you've got to build your valuation. Valuation's generally built on top of your growth trajectory. So if you're growing at a breakneck speed and you're going up and to the right there, then your value grows whether or not you're profitable. You can look at Amazon, at Uber. They weren't profitable for years and years and years,
right.
But their user acquisition was just always up and to the right. And that's where the spend goes.
So that's the key, is user acquisition. And so if you were speaking to a solopreneur that's sitting in a coffee shop, what are the things that you can tell him to avoid when building his startup or her startup?
So I've made a lot of mistakes in building startups. I've had successful exits, and I've had.
I want to hear about all of them.
I feel I can speak from some experience here. Really, I recently launched a startup called Teacup, and I'm pretty sure what killed that, the biggest mistake I made there, was building a feature that I loved that no one asked for. So I spent a huge amount of resources, time, money, development time, energy building something that I thought was just really, really cool. But the fact is, no one asked for it, no one needed it, and ultimately, it drained a lot of resources.
Interesting. And so listening would be kind of the most important factor, would you say, is listening to the customers. Now,
yeah.
Being the entrepreneur behind it, you have this vision. Do you feel that you should stick with your vision, to the end, or should you be able to, pivot? Should you be open to those changes? Because there's a lot of stories on both sides of that fence where companies that didn't listen and stuck with their path, became very successful, and can credit that. So
that's a really tricky question, because there are plenty of stories. Slack, which is just massive success, pivoted from gaming to chat. So that's a classic pivot. That's a really tough question, but I'm going to say that you can stick with your vision without committing to the product. So let's talk about a vision for small businesses. If your vision is to help small businesses succeed, You can change the product, but remain committed to the vision that actually motivates you. So I would say you can be careful of that. And then you can look at something like Slack that pivoted at the last minute. Even something like an Airbnb success story that also was kind of a pivot. They were almost Hail Marys at that last gasp. So I wouldn't really draw too much from that. So I guess to boil it down is yes, stay committed to your vision, but be flexible in how you achieve it.
Interesting. And so as far as one of the biggest things that founders miss when kind of laying that groundwork, where would you suggest that somebody really focuses when they're getting their feet under them and they notice that it's a hit?
Well, you should care about the customers you serve. So you should be able to recognize the problem because it's your problem, because you care about solving it. So it kind of makes it a lot clearer that you're actually hitting that product market fit, because you recognize that it's solving a genuine problem that you're intimately familiar with.
That's interesting. So can you create a business if you're not intimately familiar with the problem? Like, if I want to create a business about horses because I found the niche in horses, but I'm not a horse person, how would you suggest somebody going about kind of taking advantage of that niche that they discovered?
Sure. So I'll be blunt and say, if you're mildly interested in the niche because you feel that there's a pathway there, and you have come up with an idea you think is really cool, you launch it. I don't see any hopes for success, but it doesn't mean you can't learn fast. So if you're starting, if you want to build a startup around horses, well, go spend 6 months working in a stable. Or alternatively find a partner who does know them. You need, I'd say, at least one domain expert on the team. Otherwise, you won't have the credibility to connect with your customers either.
That's interesting. Okay, and so as far as niches and areas that you see rising in the future, what kind of startup niches do you see kind of a big potential with, maybe moving into 2020 and beyond?
So I've thought about this quite a lot, and I don't think I can name a specific niche like horses or plumbers or whatever, but I'd say if we're talking about trying to help someone find a niche that's going to be profitable, I'd say look for growth. Look for the size of the market itself matters, but not nearly as much as the growth of the market. So I'd say look for an industry, even if it's a very small, with 100,000 or 50,000 potential customers, but it's growing 10, 15, 20% year over year. Then I'd say that's an opportunity, because then you can grow along with the customer base.
Right. And so there's a couple of ways to kind of find that. One, as you know, is SBDC, the Small Business Development Council, which is free in many small towns and cities around the country. And we also have Google Trends. But are there any other kind of ways to find those growing industries? What do you keep your ear to the ground for? What cues do you listen for?
I'm an obsessive Googler, so I will Google X industry statistics, X industry growth. I'll look at IBIS reports as well. I'll find people in the industry and ask them how busy they are today versus 2 years ago. You can also, there's the NAICS codes as well. There's a lot of data around there. Just to absorb tons and tons of sources, and ultimately you can kind of get that feel about it. But generally there's sources that will tell you what the growth is this year versus last. It's not a struggle, I think.
Now, I think you kind of hit the nail on the head, and that's probably what sets kind of a successful entrepreneur off from somebody who may struggle a little bit, and that's the ability to pick up the phone and talk to somebody that they don't know. Because I think that in my conversations with people, that's one of those dynamics that makes for a successful entrepreneur, somebody that can ask a question to somebody that they don't know and get an answer. What other kind of characteristics do you feel make for a successful entrepreneur?
Sure. There's one key characteristic to me, which is it's the really defining one as far as I've seen, is when you hit something you don't know, you go and you learn. So whatever it takes to figure that out. So if you don't know how to get a website hosted, doesn't matter. You call a friend and you ask them how. You go to Google and you figure it how. You do some trial and error and you learn, rather than going off and spending 10% of your savings on hiring someone to do that.
Yep.
It's really a willingness to get your hands dirty, learning things for yourself as you go.
No, that drives me crazy as well. One of my favorite words is autodidact, somebody that can self-educate.
Right.
But let's say you're an autodidact. You've done the research. You get a good product. How do you know when you've reached kind of a product market fit? How do you know that's the right time?
There's I think there's about 1 million opinions on what product market fit really means, and it comes back to that old saying is you kind of know it when you see it, I guess, to some degree. I think if your customers are talking about you to other people in their industry and recommending you, if you see even a little bit of word of mouth growth,
okay,
I think that's an extremely positive sign that you've solved a problem for someone in that space. That's
a great suggestion. So keeping your ear to the ground, if we can hit on that again, to listen to the customers and to try to find out where they're hearing about your product from or your service. Now, since you're kind of an expert on this, how are software as a service companies kind of taking over the world? What's the future there?
Sure. So they're taking over the world for a relatively simple reason, is that it can be quite cheap to actually launch something. So if you have an idea, 15 years ago, you had to buy your own servers and host them yourself, and you couldn't just hire a front-end developer to get you online. Now you've got things like Stripe and Square and AWS and Heroku and all these things that solve a lot of the real headaches around bringing an idea to market. So the fact is that it's cheap to launch a startup. It's feasible to launch a startup even as a non-technical founder. And that means that you can get real niche and really granular and solve really narrow problems. And another thing that I'm noticing, especially as I started doing research for my latest startup, is that people are very comfortable using lots of tools in their business. So it used to be companies would pay huge amounts of money, use one tool, and that's it. And that tool had to do everything. Now people are comfortable having an email newsletter platform and a social media scheduler and a tool that helps with your social media headlines and an email platform. So it's a combination of those two things. People are happy to use lots of software tools, lots of different ones, and it's easy to get them to market.
Now, talking about getting them to market, you really have to get that user acquisition, honed in. What kind of marketing is effective these days? Because social media marketing, just the cost per acquisition just skyrocketed. What's still viable?
Sure. So I'm glad you said social media marketing is quite expensive, and in fact,
well, everybody always points to social media as the only way to get a product off the ground, or the only way to do this and the only way to do that. But quite frankly, it's very expensive right now.
Yeah, and it's not. You don't get the learnings that you get early on. Early on, I tell people, if you got to pay for it, don't do it. At the early stage, it's really a lot of serious grind is the best way to get your first customers, and then do everything you can to make it easy for those customers to talk about you. So if we're talking pure channels, right? Referral channels, set up an affiliate program, set up a referral program, That kind of marketing is awesome. Email newsletters are fantastic. The return on investment there is, depending on who you're listening to, is between $20 and $50 per dollar spent. So email newsletters are still a super viable, affordable way to get repeat sales, to get stay in touch with customers. And then you can't get away from the fact that at launch, really just pick up the phone. With Mad Mimi, my most successful startup I co-founded, we literally just walked up and down our neighborhood in Brooklyn handing out flyers to every business, and it got us our first customers.
I think that you touched on the exact right issue there, and that's what we see on our world as well with independent products, is that when somebody's successful, they've already walked around their neighborhoods, they've driven to the stores, and they've spoken to the store owners to put the product on the shelf, not relied on a sales team to do that, so they can get that feedback, because that's the most important.
Yeah. Exactly. It's the feedback and really just knowing your customer and knowing their objections, and it really pays dividends.
Now, can startups still make it by bootstrapping, or has that world kind of gone away because there's so many people trying to start a company these days?
No, bootstrapping is more viable than ever. We bootstrapped Mad Mimi, and it was difficult back then because we had far higher costs. Again, it comes back to the costs. You can handle, if we're talking just pure technology, you can pay $100 a month to Heroku to host your servers and handle what 15 years ago cost thousands of dollars. If we're going to talk how to really bootstrap, you can't bootstrap a social media network to compete with Facebook. That's not going to happen. You can't bootstrap a competitor to Salesforce or something like that. But you can bootstrap something very narrow, very niche, with the broader vision of serving the related and nearby markets. So you can start with a very narrow market with the eye to expand and bootstrap.
Excellent. And so let's say your little baby became a big kid. You know, when is a brand no longer a startup? You know,
it's also something I've often thought. Again, I think the defining characteristic of a startup is the growth trajectory, and often when you're growing 30% month over month, 50% month over month, you're a startup. When you've kind of plateaued and your growth is now, and your growth needs are very different, then I'd say you're no longer a startup. I guess you could talk about things like market share and profitability, etc. But I'd say also, if you still need to raise more funding, you're probably still a startup.
When should you go after funding? And is funding a good opportunity for everybody? How do you know?
I'm probably the right person to ask, because I'm a little bit dogmatic that funding isn't the right thing for everyone. So I'm possibly not. I'm possibly slightly contrary to popular thought here, but if you can do it without funding, do it without funding. I'd say the best reason to fund is once it's going to give you the resources to really light a fire under your product. So don't fundraise to prove an idea. Fundraise to really take you to the next level, to really take your growth put it on a rocket trajectory. But before that, I think funding is dangerous, and you're going to have to give up a lot of equity to convince someone to take the risk early on. So it's often not ideal, and I've seen funding actually kill companies, because you have to also understand that the VC concept, I'm sure you understand, but people need to understand that the VC model is often at odds with what the entrepreneur wants to achieve.
Now let's dig into that a little bit, because I saw an interview the other day on that, where when is the wrong time? Because you hit on the nail on the head when you said you need to prove the user acquisition model before you bring on money, so that you can put fire under the brand to develop that trajectory. But when's the wrong time to take on money? When is it just a good idea to let it grow gradually and build naturally?
Yeah. Okay, so the wrong time is when you don't need the money, but you want the article in TechCrunch, right?
Okay.
Is if you're going to if you define your company's success by the amount raised, it's probably not the right thing to do.
So the Silicon Valley model, you're saying?
Right, exactly. And the thing is that when you raise money, you give up a lot of control. And in fact, you're giving whoever's funding you, unless it's angel investment. So let me qualify that. I think raising angel rounds is fine whenever, because you're not giving up control. Raising money on a convertible debt is often fine, but proper VC money, you're giving up a lot. So there's a really narrow pathway. If you're raising that money, you're committing to a pathway of become wildly successful or die.
Yeah.
And if that's not the right pathway for you at this moment, then it's the wrong time to raise money.
No, that's exactly where I was hoping that you'd go with it, is because when you make that decision, you are kind of stuck in that lane, and it's very hard, if not impossible, to divert out of it, and you're losing a lot of your control as a founder, as the entrepreneur behind it.
Right.
But sometimes it's necessary, and sometimes it does help the business grow. Well, as far as SaaS, is that one of the challenges? What are the common challenges when growing that kind of a business?
There's a few big challenges, and certainly with SaaS, and one of the things that people find is that your customers are going to want a lot more features than you launch with. Okay. So you're going to have to keep building and iterate really quickly. And it's actually, to go back to one of your early questions, is metrics to watch out for. Velocity in terms of your development is certainly something to keep an eye on. You want to be constantly iterating and improving, and that's something you have to watch out for as you grow. And sometimes that takes a little bit of money as well. But then again, if you can raise that from angels rather than the VC route, then you're in a healthier space.
Now, what's your opinion on outsourcing versus bringing somebody in-house?
I'm okay with both. They both come with different challenges, and there are big benefits if you are not a technical founder and you want to bring something to market, and it's certainly if it's your first product. Outsourcing, certainly hiring a consultancy, you're paying a premium, right, for a company and their costs and their management structure, but at the same time, you're often acquiring a product manager and a designer and experienced developers that you might not have the resources to get without them. So if you're trying to bring something to launch within the next 5 months and you really are first time out the gate, then it's a viable way. It's not always the best thing to do, but there's an argument to be made for it. So I've seen a number of successful startups that started outsourced and moved in-house when they matured.
Okay.
And also I've seen some successful things when you've got in-house successful startups, when you start in-house and augment your team periodically with outsourced work. But I would never outsource customer support.
Interesting. So tell me about that. What is so integral with customer support that you wouldn't outsource it? Why is it important to keep that in-house?
Well, customer support is your first line of relationship with your customers. And if we're going to agree that churn and customer retention is paramount, then it's your customer support that works hardest. They double as a sales team.
Right.
They are your customer retention team. They turn people from explorers into committed. Like, your customer support gives you your lifetime value with your customer. And so there needs to be a culture fit with you as the founder, with your company, as well as with your customers. So outsourcing customer support, I find in the long run doesn't save much.
Now, Mad Mimi was legendary for their customer support. what are the things that you found that, it could be a couple tips that somebody can integrate into their business to really kind of keep customers from churning, from asking for a refund, from leaving?
Sure. One trick we did at Mad Mimi that really wowed people is we used little apps. Each customer support person, whether they were on a Mac or Windows, used their own little app. On Mac, I use something called Cloud App. It's a little screencast tool. I can record my screen, upload it within a few seconds to the cloud, and share the link. So when someone would write in with a question of how do you do X, or here's somewhere where I'm stuck, we'd record a little personalized video and send them a link that explains and walk them through visually and help them do what they needed to do. And it's a personal touch. It was so easy to do, but it really worked, and it made people feel really appreciated and treasured. And the funny thing we realized after we started doing that is that it often was quicker to do that than type an in-depth explanatory email.
Right. That's interesting. I could see that, having a technical question, it would be so much easier if somebody was just able to show me how to do it like that.
Yeah.
That's a great example. Now, what's the difference between SaaS and computer, cloud computing, having something in the cloud?
Sure. So, definitionally, I think cloud computing would be the infrastructure. AWS by Amazon, Oracle Cloud. It's the underpinning of things. SaaS is built on top of cloud computing. SaaS is the ready to use software that the end user might use. So that's in my opinion. I'm not so sure how great I am at the definitions, but that's how I would.
Okay, I think that clears up a lot for the listeners. The biggest thing when we're growing, a business, or when we're looking for new opportunities, because the world has changed so much, where do you see the growth coming from in 2020 and beyond? Where are we moving towards with this broadening market?
Well, certainly, I think we're moving more and more mobile, and it's something that I'm seeing. And I know this isn't earth-shattering news that wow, the world is going mobile, but I'm seeing a big difference between people who are slightly older than me and slightly younger than me that do 80% of their work on their laptop versus 80% of their work on their phone. So we're seeing a lot of things that we're really used to doing sitting at a desk, we're going to start seeing are going to be done more on the phone. And that has a lot of development implications. It means software needs to be built first to work on your phone and then on a desktop. And I think that switch is more and more prevalent. And then you probably noticed the accent. I'm South African, so I often think about the African market, and there companies are run with no laptops whatsoever, entirely on their phones. And so I think as US companies start looking into African markets and Indian markets, I think similar things to what we're seeing now, but really working well on phones is going to be is the trend that I think I'm seeing.
Interesting, because I heard a statistic the other day that I think it's 50 or 60% of Google searches now are answered once the question is asked, without anybody clicking on a website. Whether it comes up on the answer screen or Siri answers it, but it's moving more towards that direction. And if somebody were to develop a company now or a base, if you develop an app, how do you acquire users? That's one of the biggest past problems when I've heard about developing on mobile. Do you have any tips for anybody that is trying to gain some mobile share?
Sure. And when I say, let me qualify something. When I say mobile, I don't necessarily mean a mobile app that's on Google Play or Apple Store.
Okay.
I mean, it just with the assumption that the interaction you're going to have with your customers is mobile, is on their phone rather than like you or I today sitting in front of a laptop. So it doesn't necessarily mean you're gonna have to struggle to get seen through the mobile store. But yeah, I think acquiring users, especially if you're launching software today, it has to start with a niche. One of the big things I see that kill startups is that they don't really know who their market is. And if you really know who your market is, to a point where if you had to, you could pick up the phone and call someone who is a customer, and then hang up and call the next customer, or you can find them, say on Yelp, then customer acquisition is just a grind, but it's accessible and it's possible. And if you had to, you can walk down the street to them, or you can email them a personal email if you had to. And then if you build in the engine to generate word of mouth referrals, then I think certainly at the early stage, that's the best type of customer acquisition out there. Just to ramble on a little bit more about that, if you're local centric, then SEO is still viable. You can compete on a local level with SEO, just because Google's pretty good at that, and Google's pretty respectful of local SEO. But if you're trying to serve a national stage, the narrower the market, the easier it is to connect with the influencers in that market as well.
Excellent. Well, I really appreciate your time. Thank you so much for your advice.
Sure, my pleasure. It's fun questions, and I really appreciate you getting the wheels turning about these questions. They're fun.
Excellent. Well, I'm going to include all your information below, so if somebody wants to reach out and connect with you, but I truly appreciate your time.
Great. Thanks so much.